Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We are going to be speaking about frontier Islam today, um, and specifically what was the nature of Islam in Anatolia as all these Turkish nomads started streaming in to Byzantine territory, and more specifically, as the Ottomans started, let's say, fighting and rising in, what is it, like 1270, now actually over 2 centuries after this battle of Manzikert in 1071. So now a good amount of time later, there's a kind of a new front, a front edge of the frontier is basically over here by Nicaea. That's where the Ottomans come out from. And there's a whole variety of different groups out there, as we'll see here. There's the Osmans, which is the Ottomans, but there's a whole variety of different groups. And what I want to get to is what is actually their vision of Islam. And just to keep in mind, there's a whole variety of different frontiers in this period. Bengal is another one, Spain is another one, West Africa and Russia in different ways. And you can see here basically like 1500, where the so-called Islamic world was expanding or contracting. Not all of these expansions are necessarily at the hands of nomads or of movement of Muslims. Some of them are also by traders and other groups. So I think one way to think about the different forms of Islam that were around is to think about it as city versus nomadic, or city versus frontier. So city Islam is somewhat similar to the Islam that we were looking at when we spoke about Jalaluddin Rumi in our last lesson. It's often centered around some central institutions, places like mosques, madrasas, which are places where you would learn Islamic law. Mosques are where you would perform the congregational prayer on Fridays, places of gathering, not necessarily the place you have to come to for every prayer, but you would come for a congregational prayer there every Friday, and there would be a sermon said. And oftentimes Sufi lodges as well would become central institutions that could combine all three of these options, right? So in the Mamluk kingdom in Egypt, you had Sufi lodges that also worked as law schools and also had a space for communal prayer. Now, the city Islam was often centered around teaching law, or what you might know as Sharia. And this was done through basically different cultural elites, educated elites of the Islamic world. These are called ulema. It literally just means someone who knows something, a scholar. The singular of ulema is alim. This is a pretty common word used in Islamic studies or Islamic history. The ulama are the guys who are trained to teach religion or to have knowledge, okay? And they often congregate and use these institutions to essentially reproduce themselves and to reproduce their vision of Islam, which is often centered very heavily on law, even though, as we see, there's many different types of Sufis involved. Sufism and law, just so you know, are not necessarily oppositional. You have people like Jalaluddin Rumi emphasizing very heavily the kind of more mystical aspects and experiential aspects of religion, while still very much tying themselves to the legal prescriptions of Islam. So they wouldn't be the type of people to ignore the fact that you have to pray or you have to fast, etc. Now, this type of city Islam, besides being in the city, is also patronized by artisans, because artisans actually also live in cities. And in the case of Anatolia, there's a lot of emigres coming from essentially Iran and Central Asia, who are not nomads, right? They're people that live in cities. They are moving for economic opportunities, to start a new life, etc. And they're attaching themselves to rulers. And so there's a close connection between basically what we would consider the sort of middle class or bourgeois classes built by artisans, woodworkers and bookbinders and these sorts of people, builders, and the rulers who are also building these large edifices like this one you see here, I believe in Konya and Sivas. And they often spoke not in Turkish, but in Persian, and were reading in Persian. And when it came to issues of religion and law, they're often working in Arabic. Contrast this with something I'm going to call frontier Islam. Now, frontier Islam is not found in the cities. It's found on the edges of the Islamic world. Places like the boundary between the Byzantines and the Ottomans or other places. There you have all sorts of wandering holy men and what we call antinomians and Sufis and warlords. And they're sending out their messages and their religiosity in a different language, often Turkish vernacular. At this point, Turkish is not a very highfalutin language. It is a pretty basic language that is almost never written down. It's only used by nomadic groups, and as we'll see, in some poetry and songs. And these frontier Islamic figures basically didn't like what they considered kind of learned Islam. They didn't really even know about the legal obligations of Islam. So for the fact that you're supposed to pray 5 times a day or supposed to fast or Ramadan, none of this actually, they probably didn't know it. And if they did, they didn't really care. Even really basic facts, like for example, for Muslims, Muhammad is the seal of the prophets and is the most important prophet. This was still unclear to many people on the edges of the Islamic world. So, for example, in Bursa, a city that the Ottomans conquered pretty early on, like 1350s, already still in the 1400s, people were constantly claiming that Jesus was more important than Muhammad. So here we have kind of very basic beliefs that are not agreed upon. And instead, rather than focusing on mosques and ulama or scholars, etc., life centered around saints and holy men. And these holy men, again, were itinerant. They moved around. They led armies in different ways as well. And this was in marked contrast to the city Sufis that allied themselves with the artisans and with the rulers. Instead, these frontier Sufis, these frontier holy men, got their money and their power from the warlords, what are called ujbeyleri, these frontier warriors who are leading these groups of raiders and nomads around. And often these holy men would be marching alongside them. So here we'll see this is it says a kind of hermit, Turkish hermit, but here that means like a Sufi or and he's leading a stag. As we'll see, this is quite common. This guy's dressed in animal skins and is using a horn. It says Sayyid Ali Sultan. So these were types of like frontier figures constantly found on the frontier, obviously. And the places that they congregated were not the madrasa, they were not the mosques. In fact, there were no madrasas or mosques on the frontier. Instead, there were basically holy shrines, like we saw last time, and Sufi lodges, but different from the ones found in cities. So just to give you a sense of what some of these shrines are still around, this is a guy called Geyikli Baba, which you could translate as stag daddy. Geyik is a stag, that is a male deer. Geyikli is like someone who has a stag or staggish, and Baba is for dad, or in this case also a term of respect for holy men. So he was a sheikh attached to a Turkoman tribe, so a nomadic Turkish tribe, and he helped the Ottomans conquer the city of Bursa in like 1354 or whatever. And he did it because he was always marching with them, and he actually rode on the back of a gigantic stag into battle. And you can see actually, if you go to his tomb, there's still horns hanging from the ceiling of his tomb to kind of show this connection. One with animals, and two with the power of the frontier at this time. Often in these shrines, they're centered around giant trees, there's usually a holy tree in the center of each village today in Turkey. And these were often sites of religious worship as well. Many of, but not all, but many of these frontier Sufis or frontier Muslims subscribe to or were very supportive of something called antinomianism. What is antinomianism? Anti just means against, nomos is law. So it's being against the law. In this case, it's an idea that you should be completely against societal prescriptions, and in this, and often those are divided by the law. So all the legalistic norms that it meant to be a Muslim, that you should do ablutions before prayed, or that you should pray, or any of these things, or that you should run around naked. They were ways. All of these laws were actually for these antinomians. They were obstacles to getting close to God, because Muslims, would observe these laws and want to be told that they are good Muslims, and they would think that the only thing that is leading them towards God is following these rules. But actually, they were a sort of barrier. They were a covering, a veil on top of the true religion. And so what you had to do is to reject these laws and not just like reject them and like just avoid praying, but you had to purposefully show people that you were flouting them, right? You were going out of your way to offend people. So they ran around naked. They pierced themselves and their genitals and all sorts of things. Again, these are all men, so it's really just their penises that are being pierced. They wore giant animal skins and put horns and other things through their bodies. The whole point is basically social deviance of every possible rule. So think, if you can imagine what the hippies were in the 1960s, probably something like that, where the whole system for them is the social world is corrupt, and therefore what you have to do is kind of show that you're rebelling against it by flouting all the rules. And this was very popular form of religious movement between 1250 to 1500, mostly in Iran, but throughout the Middle East, and it continued on afterwards, but with less gusto. And they received a lot of support from common people who would give them food, because these people didn't work. They would live in giant camps and go out into cities and just beg and bother people until they gave them something to live on. And they did receive a lot of support because they were seen as almost holy fools, holy men. And they attracted people from, the richest princes to also the most common person. And we can see one here in this picture of Rumi. Here's Rumi on the horse and in the very fine clothes, or he's on a mule. But here's this antinomian version, dervish walking barefoot in an animal skin with a club. So very different visions of what Islam is. Here's other depictions from Persian albums and miniatures from the period. So you can see these guys sometimes walking around naked, barely clothed, would have large piercings everywhere. They would shave their head. And as you notice, they're not wearing any head covering. Look back here. Everyone here has their head covered. Even this guy has some sort of head covering, but he's shaved his head completely. He doesn't, and he shaved his beard, and he has these giant piercings. And that's kind of showing that he's rejecting the traditional way that a man should present himself. They would carry spears and sticks and giant clubs, partially just to scare people. I don't think they were actually attacking people with them. This guy, this is from a European depiction. You can see how he's clothed in animal hides and basically walking around barefoot. And this is a description of one of these antinomians called Barak Baba in the year 1306. So Barak Baba arrived in Syria in 1306 at the head of a group of about 100 dervishes, naked except for a red cloth around his waist. He wore a reddish turban on his head with a buffalo horn attached on either side. His hair and mustache were long, while his beard was clean shaven. He carried with him a long pipe or horn, as well as a dervish bowl. He did not accumulate any wealth. His disciples were of similar appearance, carrying long clubs, tambourines, and drums, bells, painted ankle bones with molar teeth attached to the strings, suspended from their necks. And wherever they met, they went. The disciples played, and Barak Baba danced like a bear and sang like a monkey. It's reported that Barak Baba had control over wild animals, and he's demonstrated by scaring a ferocious tiger and riding a wild ostrich on 2 different occasions. And apparently, he exercised similar control over his disciples, whom he forced to perform the prescribed religious practices on pain of 40 blows of bastinado. So in this case, he actually is forcing them to pray and stuff, but only not because they wanted to. They really didn't want to, but because he was going to beat them. Bastinado is when you flip someone over and you hit them on the soles of their feet with a cane. Nonetheless, the dervishes were renowned for their antinomian ways, which included failure to observe the ritual fast and the consumption of legally objectionable foods and drugs. So basically, they're eating all sorts of non-halal things and taking a lot of drugs, basically hashish and opium. Mamluk sources also accuse them of belief in metempsychosis and the denial of the existence of the hereafter. So these are important theological projections. While to Barak himself, he's imputed an excessive love of Ali, remember the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, which he viewed as the sole religious obligation. So it's more important to love Ali than it is to love Muhammad or to do any of the other stuff. Now, this is an extreme example. These are types of antinomian dervishes, many of whom exist on the frontier, but also as these antinomians were living, moving in Syria, Iran, in the center of the Islamic world as well. But they also flocked to the frontier. Not all of them were like that. This is another frontier saint. His name is Haji Bektash Veli. In many ways, he's sort of the opposite of Jalaluddin Rumi that we saw. They both came from Khorasan, from Central Asia, from Iran. But he, instead of going to the city and establishing ties with the ruler, he basically went out into the middle of nowhere, into the steppe of Anatolia, and set up a lodge there. And from there attracted a popular following. And in fact, there's a whole book of holy deeds of all the different miracles that he performed. And as you can see here in this depiction, includes befriending animals, in this case, the lion and the stag. And it's through his poetry, which he was spreading around in Turkish, that he came to be known so widely. And this is, today you can go see his tekke, his complex or lodge. And this place is really in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it's like you have to drive like 40 minutes from the nearest town today to get there. And it's a major site of religious pilgrimage today, but it's kind of like a gigantic fortress in the middle of nowhere. And you can see the site, the difference, right? It's fortress-like, it's not in a city, it's in the countryside, and it's meant to attract and interact with the nomadic groups moving through. In comparison, Jalaluddin Rumi, he's very closely tied to the Seljuk state. Haji Bektash has no ties to the Seljuk state. His tomb complex is in the smack center of Konya, right next to the tombs of all the sultans. He's a scholar who turns into Sufism, whereas this guy, Haji Bektash, is basically not. He's a holy man who was never a scholar in any way. Other people on the frontier are figures like Yunus Emre. Yunus Emre today is famous as sort of medieval Turkish poet. And you can find his rather simple Turkish poetry all over. And it was actually refound and rediscovered in the 17th century, but it's neither here nor there. He would write poems like these, right? These are the type of frontier poetry, the same type of stuff sometimes Rumi would write. But this one, will have a different message. For example, he says, "Do not tell me I don't pray. I know my prayers. Whether I pray or not, God knows my supplication." So he says, it doesn't matter if I pray. What matters is if I'm really loyal to God. He says, I'm a Sufi, always carrying a rosary in public, the beads that they would hold. My tongue utters spiritual truths, but my heart does not embrace them. So here he's insulting Sufis, right? He's saying, oh, you call yourself a Sufi, you pretend to be pious. You're saying, you pretend to say spiritual truths, but you really don't believe them in any way. What really matters is the heart and everything. And he says kind of, oh, lovers, lovers is lovers of God, love the lover in general is a figure in poetry. Oh, lovers, right and religion for me is love. In fact, love is beyond all known religions. Our religion is other than all religions. Our religion and piety is not to be found in any religion. Right. So he's very much rejecting all the sort of formal visions of Islam or any sort of religion at this time. Um, he sees kind of Islam as a sort of general love of humanity, almost making it secular, but as love that goes beyond any sort of religion or sect or any actual care about formal definitions of what Islam is. And in fact, in general, for him, scholarship and learning are an obstacle to loving God. Of course, you need the legal prescription, you need to pray, you need to fast, but they have to be done with love because otherwise you're just going to be a complete hypocrite. So these city Sufis, for example, and legalistic scholars, they go around, they pray, they fast, they do all this stuff, but it doesn't mean anything because they don't really have it in their heart. They don't have this love of God in their heart. One more guy, Kaygusuz Abdul. Kaygusuz means like worry-free, carefree. Abdul is a name for another type of popular dervish religious figure on the frontier. There used to be a lot of Abdals in Anatolia in the 14th to 16th century, but they basically disappeared after that. So we don't know anything about his life. He was probably born somewhere in the late 14th century, so late 1300s. One thing is clear is that he doesn't care at all about Islamic law. He doesn't think that has any use. It doesn't lead to the divine. And in fact, trying to be Muslim by following, by praying, or by fasting or going on the Hajj is completely useless. And the same goes for learning about the law or learning about theology or any of this stuff. It's pointless. The only way to be a good Muslim is to kind of model yourself on Ali, the son-in-law and rightful successor of Muhammad. At this point, this doesn't mean that he's a Shia. This doesn't mean anything like that. It just means that he saw Ali as particularly righteous and good model, as a model of being close to the Prophet Muhammad. And if you could do that, if you could model yourself on Ali and on your actions without using the Quran or without using legal stuff, etc., then you could be a good Muslim. And the worst people, though, for him, the Sufis that want to follow Sharia, they're basically just hypocrites. So here's an example. This Kaygusuz Abdul basically rejects law, rejects all the formal trappings of Islam. Yunus Emre is kind of in the middle path, right? He still says that you can pray, you should pray, but it really doesn't help you if you don't have love in your heart. Whereas you have Jalaluddin Rumi, who's kind of combining the two. It basically says, you have to pray and you have to have some sort of larger Sufistic vision. This guy, Jalaluddin Rumi, is in the city. These guys are in the frontier. Okay, one last guy, Othman Baba, another example. Wandered around the mountains of northwest Anatolia until 1453. Then he moves to the Balkans and Bulgaria. And all this time, he basically refuses to have any sort of luck, refuses to have any sort of formal recognition, doesn't want to be put in a normal house, right? So he's always living in basements, furnace rooms, etc. And through this constant rejection of the self, he gains a few hundred Abdal followers, so kind of frontier holy men types. He spends all this time going through the countryside, trying to get enough food for his followers and bringing it back to them. In fact, many of his miracles are basically about him, like being able to procure 2 goats so they could eat for the day or something like that. And he was so shabby looking, people just thought he was a runaway slave. They weren't clear if he was a Muslim or even, deserved to be fed, etc. The only time he ever wanted to pray is to create like miracles that would actually help people. So, for example, allowing the Ottoman armies to conquer areas, right? So he would help the army by lending them his spiritual power, helping them contact God, who would then let them conquer others. At the same time, he basically rejects all the Sufi orders and all the kind of established orders from the cities, because he just sees them all as imposters. He really thinks that true saints like him, or holy men, they don't need to deal with Sufism. all they need to do is demonstrate their holiness with, by showing miracles, like having divine inspiration and speaking what are called moments of divine truth. And if you could do that, then you can be a true Muslim, or you could be, have a true connection to God. And so what I want to get across here is that all of these people, they are quite different from what you imagine Muslims to be, right? So these are guys who call themselves Muslims, who are fighting for the Ottomans or fighting for other, other principalities at the time, different Turkish emirates. But their vision of Islam is completely different from what we might imagine it today, and it was very different from what was around in the cities. Now, what kind of religious sites did they actually have? What is around today? Basically, what we have is tombs. Again, tombs could be something like this. This is basically a Roman grave that was turned into a tomb. You can find this in Amasya. It became a site of, people coming to pray at it. Otherwise, you had Sufi lodges, but these lodges were different. They weren't just the ones like the cities. They were kind of like we call them T-shaped lodges because they were to look like this, an upside down T, if you look at their schematics. And what today they're basically mosques. So this area here is converted into the niche. There's usually a mihrab facing Mecca that's been added. But back then, back in the frontier times, they were basically soup kitchens. They were there to host travelers. And any visitor could come to this place and get 3 days of food and lodging for free. Afterwards, you're kind of expected to move on or to at least help pay or something like that. Now, these weren't located in cities. They're mostly located in the countryside and near villages, on the edges of cities, right? These aren't places that are being sponsored by kings in the center of the city. So Rumi's tomb, for example, is smack in the middle of Konya. It's at the center of Konya. These places are often on the edges of the city, quite far from the center of power, or right on these new Muslim villages that are being established. Now we can see basically that it's hard to imagine just through the schematics. You can see there's a sort of central space, and then there's kind of side rooms here. There should be over here these labeled number 4. These are basically accommodation spaces for travelers. And then there would be a space for congregational prayers, but it wouldn't be a mosque. There wouldn't be necessarily a mihrab here. So today they function solely as mosques, but back then they were kind of like multi-purpose soup kitchen hotels with like large fires on the sides. So here's one today. This is a very fancy one on the edges of Bursa, today in the center of Bursa, but back then it was on the edge. Bursa is a major Byzantine city that the Ottomans conquered. And they built this Yeşil Cami, the green mosque. But back then it was a T-shaped mosque, T-shaped lodge. And if you were to go inside, you would see actually, this one's very fancy, it has nice tile work, etc. And this would be the communal prayer area. Now they've added the pulpit and all this other stuff that makes the mosque. But you have these large fireplaces, tabkhanes, fire rooms attached to them. Now, there are actually remnants of this medieval type of frontier Islam today. And one of them is through the vision of Alevis. Alevis are basically the largest religious minority in Turkey. For a long time, they were not acknowledged to kind of even exist as a group. But they face a lot of discrimination, partially because their practices, religious practices, are quite different from what you would find in a normal mosque. So if you were, they're the center of a Alevi space of worship. It's called the Cem Hane, Cem Evi. Cem means gathering place, to gather. and it's, again, a central congregational space. Here they have pictures of Ali, and they have pictures of Muhammad, or I don't know if this is supposed to be Muhammad, but you definitely have pictures of Ali. It says, for example, "Oh God, oh Muhammad, oh Ali." They're not Shi'is. They just see Ali as the central aspect of their worship. And then you have basically a sort of dance that would be performed in these congregational spaces attached to, that would be played with music. As you can see, it's a mix of men and women, women often taking large space. So this is, let's see. So they're basically singing a sort of hymn chant. Let's see if we can jump to the dancing. So what you get here, you can kind of see the connection. Okay, here's a part. Let's see if we can see the Sema part of the Alavi Gem, where they would be doing this dancing part. See in the background, there's a giant picture of Ali. So obviously, the Alavi gem has changed since whatever 1500s, etc. Alavism itself, as we'll see, is a development in response to persecution by the Ottomans, starting in the 1500s, which we'll get into. But what we have here is aspects of kind of Sufi ceremonies, Alid beliefs, etc., that were very prominent on the frontier, very prominent in Anatolia and Iran and Syria, etc. It could be found in many different places, and this is probably what Islam, to some degree, looked like on the frontier, where you don't have, again, mosques and madrasas, etc., but you do have these sort of congregational spaces, soup kitchens, etc. And by the way, today you can still find there's many Alavis. They tend to be centered in these mountainous regions in eastern central Anatolia, especially Dersim and things like that. Why there? Because basically they faced a lot of persecution, and they were kind of, they moved to mountain areas where they were difficult to persecute, to be found. A lot of them were also purposely moved out to Bulgaria and to Western Anatolia. Today, still, there is a lot of say discrimination, or at least general suspicion of Alevis in mainstream Turkish society, which tends to be kind of Sunni. This kind of Alevi rights, or let's say Alevi identity, broke out after a massacre that occurred in a hotel called the Mademak Hotel. It's in a city called Sivas, which is in central Anatolia. You can see here on this map. There was basically a meeting of musicians. It was their Alevi meetings. Congresses were basically centered around music, and so it was often seen as music. But to make a long story short, a mob gathered. These Alevi people were inside the hotel. The mob shut them in and then set the hotel on fire, during which you can see about 30 people, or over 30 people, died. And it's that massacre and the response to it that set off the kind of movement towards Alevi rights today. There's other groups throughout the Middle East that can be found that have aspects of this frontier religiosity, not just Alevis. For example, if you were to go to Iran, there's a group called the Yarsan, or the Ahle Haq, the people of truth. Sometimes they're pejoratively called Ali Ilahis, which is people who think that Ali is God because they would worship Ali. It's believed that they worship Ali as a god himself. And if you were to go to Iran, these aren't my pictures, but you can find their shrines in different places. And you have similar types of religiosity centered around playing music, some dancing, and a communal meal, which is the central religious rite of their community. In that process of giving the communal meal and gathering and playing music and chanting is their vision of, of being Muslim. So why is this important for a class? One, it's because we have to think again, as there's a process of conversion, as Anatolia becomes predominantly Muslim over the course of 1200 to 1500, and also the Balkans as the Ottomans come into there, we have to think about what kind of Islam was being distributed, or let's say were Christians encountering. What did it mean to convert, and how would you even become Muslim in this situation? Would the fact that you just spent time at a guest house make you a Muslim? Would that end up being a form of religious worship? If you were to eat at one of these communal meals or to witness one of these dancing Sema events, is that a religious ceremony? Because again, this isn't a space in which people are encountering mosques and madrasas and being instructed in the basics of Islam. Instead, they're encountering holy men, poets, poetry, and things like that from a whole variety of different people. The other thing to think about is this close connection between the frontier warriors and the antinomians and the Sufi holy men in this period, and particularly how the holy men were able to transform their power into something, or their spiritual power into a sort of political power. And often this would be the case. Almost every revolt in medieval Anatolia from around 1250, where there's this Baba Ilyas revolt, to 1500, starts off with a holy man, a Sufi, frontier Sufi, raising up a group of frontier warriors or nomads through their spiritual authority and the way that they use poetry to navigate this world. So keep that in mind as we keep talking, and we'll talk more soon.